to take the opportunity to turn it over to Luke. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. My name is Luke Vargas. I'm a sophomore here at Penn State, and I'm a sports editor here at the Daily Collegian. And so I have the pleasure of introducing Michael Weinreb, who's going to be speaking with us today and answering some of our questions. I'd encourage everybody to ask questions today. I've got plenty prepared. I could fill up about 5 hours of questions for Michael, but I'm sure he'd be more interested in hearing from some of you all, not just me the whole time. So our speaker today, Michael, has spent his career working as a journalist and author and sort of mastering the content production of the written word. He's been working for Rolling Stones, Vice Sports, Grantland, The Athletic, The Ringer, pretty much any sports outlet that you can imagine. And then he's also written 4 books in his time, including the award-winning Kings of New York, or Game of Kings, which won the Quill Award in 2007, among a host of other awards for being one of the top sports stories of that year. Michael, I just want to start off by asking you some questions about what you did in your time here at the Daily Collegian in the 90s. Not to date you, sorry about that. And just to sort of relate to everyone here and what we do now and what you were doing back then.
Yeah, it feels like it was an entirely different world back then. And I actually, was on the Collegian with RJ, and I think I see Erin Strout here, even if she's muted. But so a couple people that I worked with back in the day. But, I was there in the early 90s. So the internet wasn't even in existence at that point. We were still putting out a print newspaper every day. We were still trying to fill the space in the print paper and having the professional folks back in the shop lay it out for us, which it was just an entirely different world. But I think what was probably the same was that we were like, there was just a group of us who were there all the time, who just spent all our time there and felt like it was the most valuable experience that we had at Penn State, because it was basically a professional apprenticeship and you could kind of take it and run with it in whatever direction you wanted to. So I hope that's still kind of the same. I know a lot has changed in terms of like the industry and that, I can try to talk to some of that stuff, but that's you guys now, like that's where the world's going to go is going to be up to you guys. But I do think as much as journalism has changed, as much as like, the idea of print media has changed and is pretty much dead now. The idea of the Collegian itself is still a great one, because I think it just prepares you to do so many different things. So
it's my understanding that you moved here to State College when you were about 5 years old. I think you said that back in 2017 when you spoke here in the Belisario College. I think one of my main questions for you, as a very prolific writer and clearly a very prolific sports fan, or a very passionate person about sports, which one of those two things came first, and how did they grow on their own, and then when did they really come together?
Sort of what was did growing up in State College kind of turn me into a sports fan? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Sure.
Yeah. I think how could it not? It's like sports is so central to everything at Penn State. Football is so central to everything at Penn State, for better or for worse, So I think it was just kind of ingrained in me from a young age. I was even like, I grew up like my first few years in kind of outside of New York City, because my dad was a college professor and was a college professor at Penn State, and is kind of semi-retired now. But I just think those things were completely intertwined, where the presence of sports and the presence of football at Penn State was just so hard to ignore, especially when you were a little kid. It just seemed, the scope of it is so huge. You go to those games, even when you're an adult, and to see 100,000 people spread out in those fields and outside that stadium and then inside that stadium, when you're like a 6-year-old kid, it's like just 100 times bigger. Everything just seems so huge. And so I think I always enjoyed sports and followed sports, wanted to be a part of sports in some way. But then I sort of got into writing too, and that was probably when I was pretty young as well, got into writing and reading, and kind of wanted to find a way to intertwine those two things, and growing up reading the sports page, it just sort of made sense to, kind of go in that direction. And my first, well, I guess my first kind of journalism job was at like the high school newspaper here at State College High School. And then, I had a teacher who helped land me an internship at the Center Daily Times when I was still in high school, which was basically like me just rewriting press releases and putting them in the newspaper, but, and like fetching coffee for people and stuff like that. But it was like, it just felt like, and then, I actually wanted to join the Collegian while I was still in high school, and they were like, you can't do that. So then I just had to wait and did it. I think it was the summer of my freshman year when I started. And I just thought that was my main priority, was to take that Collegian test and try to get on the school paper and kind of become a working sports writer. And now I've done like 37 other things since then, and had 37 other ideas of what I wanted to do with my career since then. But that was kind of the beginning of it, I guess, and I think it was all intertwined with growing up in State College and growing up around Penn State for sure.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about how things might have changed, or that idea of things have changed early on. You talked about coming here and being here in State College and going to college here at Penn State, but you also started off at Boston University. You were there for about a year, as I understand it, doing creative writing. Can you talk a little bit about that year and that period, and then eventually switching over to Penn State?
Well, so those were flipped actually. So that was grad
Really?
school. So what I did actually was talking about how I wanted to do 75 different things. I didn't realize that until I left Penn State. And then so I was just at Penn State, and then I got my first job in Akron, Ohio. And I was a reporter in Akron, Ohio at the Akron Beacon Journal for 4 to 5 years. That was kind of how you did it back then. That was the only option, was like, I remember applying for internships and then applying for jobs. And you would go into this, it was like the editor and publisher magazine, which I don't even know if it still exists. Maybe it does online. And I would get the address and the name of the sports editor for every single newspaper in the country. And I would just send out 100 resumes and 100 sets of clips, and just hope that somebody would respond. And that's kind of what happened with Akron. And they were like, kind of gave me my first job there. So then I did that for a few years. And then I wanted to go to, I kind of got into the idea of writing fiction and kind of, different sorts of prose writing. And so that's kind of when I applied to BU and went to BU for a year to study fiction writing, essentially. So that was kind of one of the first detours in my career, which there have been like I said, like 17 different detours in my career. But I do think, I know I'm speaking to Collegian people, so maybe it sounds like pandering, but I do think like the Collegian just prepared me for all of that stuff. It was like, there was always just that foundation of knowing how to write and knowing how to report at least a little bit. I'm not a great reporter. I still don't think I'm a great reporter, but sort of at least knowing the basics of it. That was the foundation for everything. That was the foundation for I want to tell stories in some way, shape, or form. And that's still what I'm trying to do, but it all kind of started there. And that was sort of the early trajectory then, was like, Penn State, Akron, then Boston, and then kind of out into the world, into freelancing and all sorts of other stuff.
I've got to ask, I have some other questions about this that leans a little more into our topic for today, but just now you just said you weren't a great reporter, but there's plenty of evidence to show that you're a great writer in so many ways. Talk to us a little bit why you don't consider yourself a great reporter.
I just don't think instinctually, I don't think I could ever be an investigative reporter. I don't think I have that in me. I think you have to have that in you. It was interesting when I was working at kind of freelancing for ESPN years ago, and there was like a kind of a gathering of all the enterprise and feature writers. And I remember there were those of us who were sort of the feature writers, and we would talk to the investigative and the enterprise writers, and we would just be like, I don't understand how you do what you do, how you can sort of pull out this, and they would be like, well, we don't understand how you can do what you do. So obviously there are some people who can do both, and then you're set. If you're a great kind of investigative reporter and you have those skills of that doggedness and that ability to kind of get to people and make connections and cultivate sources, and you're able to write well, then you're really set. I always felt like I was a writer first and a reporter second, and for most people, it's probably, there's going to be emphasis on one or the other. But I think I've managed to learn how to report in my own way and to learn how to report for the stories that I do and the work that I do, and to do research in my own sort of way.
Absolutely. Michael, today we're talking about leveraging your time here at the Collegian, how we can get the most out of your 4 years working at the Daily Collegian, or however many years you end up working here. So in my case, I've only got about 2 years left in an ideal scenario. So you spoke a little bit generally about how the Collegian prepared you and built up a foundation for the rest of your career and all the places that it took you. What specifically, maybe the traits of what you were doing, or the characteristics of the work itself, or maybe just the actual day-to-day experiences, what can you speak to that really built up that foundation you mentioned?
It's a good question. I mean, I think being around people, talented people who sort of, you see what their skills are, and maybe, like I said, everybody's going to have different skills in terms of the way they tell stories and the way that they're able to report. So being around that and being around that energy of a newspaper is extremely valuable, I think. And just, I think just the repetition of like having to write so much, having a beat and being like, I have to churn out, 3 stories a week or 4 stories a week or whatever it is. And, maybe the beats that you're covering, especially early on, you're like, how am I going to write 4 stories about the cross country team this week? And you kind of have to find your way through it and find interesting angles and learn how to ask questions that, maybe other people aren't asking. So I think just having that repetition of having to write all the time is good, and it's something that you don't really get anywhere else. And it helps you to kind of find your voice and figure out what kind of writer and what kind of reporter you're going to be. So that was probably the 2 most valuable things, I think, were just having those interactions with people and friendships, and then kind of just being able to figure out a little bit more who you are and what kind of writing you want to do.
So earlier when we first started, you mentioned that maybe you don't really know the landscape of this business as well as you did when you were deep in the thick of it. Or maybe things have totally changed, and that, we're now the generation that's building up this atmosphere that might be a little different, or this landscape that's totally different. What advice can you offer us? How can we make the most of our time? What specifically would you say we should apply ourselves to? And yeah, if you're able to offer us any concrete advice in that way.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you just have to be prepared for everything, I think you kind of have to, have skills that go beyond writing at this point. Like for me, I'm working on a couple different podcasts at this point, and scripting them and narrating them. So I'm kind of learning all that as I go. I'm working on screenwriting, which is a completely different skill. So I think for you guys at this point, it's just so hard to know where the business is going to be. So, and I think you have to figure out What kind of stories do I want to tell? What's my niche going to be? How can I kind of find a niche? Whether that's, in sports, whether it's in politics, whether it's in, business journalism. I think kind of finding that niche probably helps a little bit, but it's weird because as I say that, I'm like, you also want to have very diverse skills too. You want to be able to tell different types of stories. So in a way, I sort of wish that I had jumped around to different staffs more often. I did a little bit, but I was mostly in sports, and I kind of wish I had been, maybe a news reporter for a little bit, or maybe like a straight opinion writer for a little bit, and just kind of experimented with different things and figured out which one was right for me. So I think that's, especially early in your collegiate career, that's kind of a cool thing that you have access to, is to be like, I can try out being this for a semester, and I can try out being, something completely different for a semester. And then eventually maybe you'll zero in on the thing that you're like, okay, this is what I want to do. And you also have to be prepared for, like, maybe I don't want to work in journalism, because it's a really uncertain field, and it's going to be an uncertain field for a while. So, what would be my fallback plan? What would I want to do? Would I want to work in public relations? Would I want to, maybe work in a different type of, like, work in radio or something like that, or whatever, work in TV. So you just kind of, I think you guys just have to be kind of thinking constantly, like, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to be kind of specializing in the written word? Are there other things that I would want to do? Are there other things adjacent to journalism that I would want to do? Because I don't know what the future is going to look like at all, and you guys don't really either. So I think just having that diversity of skills, both within the collegian and even beyond journalism itself, is important. That's the other thing I sort of wish that I did that I didn't do, and I probably shouldn't say this, but part of me wishes that I hadn't majored in journalism, because the collegian was a journalism major, and the journalism department is much better, frankly, than it was when I was there. The sports journalism department didn't exist. I'm sure I would have joined the sports journalism program immediately when I had gotten to Penn State if it existed. So there are those options, but you should be thinking outside those options too. I assume everybody who majors in journalism still has to minor in something. So think about that minor pretty hard, and like, what would be my backup plan? Would I want to, teach history, or, I think I minored in sociology, and it felt like I was just like choosing a minor because I was like, I have to choose something, but I think you just have to think beyond a little bit, just because things are so uncertain in journalism itself.
It's a great answer. So Max Ralph put in the chat, you've considered yourself a great writer.
I don't know about that, but
you've considered yourself a great writer. I'm pretty sure, Max, I'm the one who's calling him a great writer, but I'm sure everyone else does as well. How are you tailoring your skills to a changing journalism world with video and multimedia platforms taking over?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, I'm working on 2 podcasts right now. I think for me, I've definitely recognized that long form journalism, print journalism, or whatever print, internet, whatever the hell you want to call it, there's not a lot of places for it right now. So I kind of wanted to move into different things, and I also for me, I think it was time for me to sort of move beyond journalism and try to create things. So for me, it was, like I said, working on podcasts now, working on screenwriting and trying to figure that out, and sort of moving into different areas beyond just the print medium, beyond just that sort of static idea of writing long form articles. I think I'd also done it for long enough that I was like, I don't know if I have anything left to say or to do, so to kind of, I'm probably doing the same thing that you guys are going to have to do. It's like figuring out how to translate my skills into different areas, and what I enjoy and kind of what I'm passionate about. So, I've been lucky enough that I haven't really had a full-time job in like 20 years, it's just been freelancing here and there, which is like kind of like living life without a safety net. But that's just kind of the way I am, that I don't think I was built to sort of work in a corporate environment, So I think I've always been kind of exploring different ways to tell stories and trying to figure out what ways appeal to me. I think that's kind of the ways that I've tried to expand my horizons a little bit, I guess. I can't remember exactly what the question was. I hope that sort of answered it.
Max will let us know, I'm sure, in the chat. You said something extremely interesting to me. He said, absolutely. Just now, you talked about preferring the freelance life, even though it's much more uncertain. It doesn't have that security that, a nailed down position might have in an already very uncertain field, as you said. Tell us about all the places, not all of the places you've worked at. Let me rephrase that. Tell us about the environments that you've worked in, the kind of structure it has, because us here at the Collegian, we only know this really rigid structure. You have your beat, you've got your staff, you're working under this editor who's under this editor. What environments have you been in? What have you liked? What have you not liked? And how did you come to this conclusion that you prefer freelancing over working for those different places and those atmospheres?
Yeah, I mean, I started in newspapers, like I said. I started in Akron, so I was kind of in that structured, rigid form. Now, with sports writing, it's always a little different, where you're not working 9 to 5 anyway, where you're sort of covering games on the weekends and at night and things like that. You never go into the office anyway, because sports writers never really went into the office. So that was one thing, is that I never really I had an office job for like 1 year, working for a magazine. And that was about it. Other than that, I think, I did work for a couple of newspapers in New York when I moved there after grad school. But it was always kind of part-time. And then I sold my first book. So I started kind of working on that full-time. And then it was working for websites, kind of writing for ESPN and writing for Grantland after that. But all of that, it was sort of unstructured, which is kind of scary. It's kind of like, you got to motivate yourself. You got to push yourself to figure out what the hell you're doing every day, and how you're going to make money, and how you're going to balance making money with creating things that you want to create. So I think I've done the structured stuff and I've done the unstructured stuff. And I think for me, it works better, the unstructured stuff. For a lot of you, it might work better being in a sort of a more structured environment, but it's also, like you said, it's journalism. Like, there is no structure. There's so little structure anymore. Even the places that you're going to wind up working for, you're probably going to get laid off once or twice. It's like, that's just the way things are. Now, maybe things will stabilize. I hope things will stabilize, but you're going to have to, if you really want to do it, you're going to have to persist through all of that and figure out ways to make it work. And you might have to go without a net at certain times, if you get laid off and you have to freelance for a year or two. So I think you should always kind of be thinking about that. Like, what would I do if I wasn't in this structured environment? How would I pitch stories? What kind of stories would I want to pitch? What kind of work would I want to do that would help me make money, and sort of bridge the gap. So I think that's just kind of the way the journalism world is now. I mean, I hope all you guys, if you want to work in journalism, that you're able to get a job at a website or at a newspaper or something that's structured, because it's a great way to kind of learn what you're doing and what your voice is and all those sorts of things. But it might not be that way. And I think that's a little bit actually what happened to me, I think, is that I always thought I would just work at a newspaper or a magazine and kind of be a long form feature writer. But those jobs started to go away. in the early 2000s when the internet came about. And they were always sort of hit and miss jobs. And it was always like, I had a couple offers to be a beat writer, covering whatever, covering the Yankees or covering this or that. And I would just think about it and I would be like, I don't think I want to, it would give me chills. I would be like, I don't think I want to do that. I think it would just I'd be miserable doing it, So, and I was, lucky enough financially to be able to make it through. So, I don't know. I just think those are things that you guys sort of have to figure out, is like, what sort of environment is going to work for me best in terms of the kind of work I want to do, the kinds of stories I want to tell, and frankly, like, how committed am I to journalism? How much do I really want to do this?
So we have two questions in the chat right now. I'm gonna go with Zach Allen's question because it's definitely on this topic. His question was, if the journalism market is uncertain and ever changing, where we should have backup plans, what are the benefits of journalism in your mind? And I think you were sort of on the tail end of that when you just finished what you were saying.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I had an answer for that was like, do this, but I don't. But I think the one thing is that if you can read and write well, if you can write well, especially, I mean, you see what's on the internet these days. Most people can't read and write that well. Most people can't process ideas that well. So there's always room for that sort of storytelling. I mean, some of the stuff that I've done to make money in the last, 10 years or whatever, I've written sponsored content, for Airbnb or whoever else. I've written, for, like the Atlantic has a partnership where they just do sponsored content. And sometimes I've written some of that stuff and it pays really well, So there's that whole sort of content marketing or whatever they want to, that was the term they used years ago. I don't know if they still use that anymore. So there are those niches that you can find if you know how to write well. And if you can write clean copy, there's so many people. It's always amazing to me, like when I turn in a story to a major outlet and they're like, this is so like cleanly written. It's so much cleaner than most of the copy that we get, and it's like, that seems like the simplest part to me. It's just being able to like write without, typos or just poorly written sentences or, just kind of cohesive ideas. So I think if you can do that, if you can focus on that, if that's what you want to do, if you want to be a writer or a journalist in some way, shape, or form, and you can write well and you can tell stories well, and you don't have to be you don't have to be like Maggie Haberman or whatever and be this investigative reporter. You can just interview people well and tell interesting stories. That's going to get you pretty far. I do think that there's ways to leverage that, if journalism collapses even further. Every company in the world is looking for somebody who can tell stories well. So many of the people that I know, either from college or beyond college, who are really talented journalists and writers, they've just, they needed to make money. So they've kind of gone into that world, into that corporate world. I have a friend who's like in New York, and she worked for financial publications for a long time. And now she's working for Morgan Stanley, and she heads their, all their sort of editorial type of content. So there's ways to leverage that. I think, I think it's kind of a way to find a path to a backup plan in case journalism doesn't work out. So that's what I would really focus on. I think that's to get at the larger question of this, whatever we're doing, Q&A seminar. I think that's kind of the main thing, is like, just learn how to read, write well, tell stories well, interview people pretty well, ask interesting questions, and put all that together as well as you can. And those skills are going to take you somewhere. I don't know where, but they're going to take you somewhere.
So Jade has a question, a little more about spending your time here at the Collegian. During your time at the Collegian, how did you work with others and learn from them? How would you recommend current staffers take advantage of the opportunity to work with other young journalists?
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about it. It was interesting, when I was at the Collegian, my best friend from first grade was the editor-in-chief my junior or senior year, I can't remember which, Mike Abrams, who's now at the New York Times. So, it's like, it was cool. It was like, we just both happened to end up in journalism together. But, I had a group of sports writers who I was really close with, and we were all, I think you're meeting all these people, and you all come from all these different backgrounds, and you all come from all these different places, and you all sort of have different stories, and you're all learning how to tell stories in a way that filters through your own background, that filters through who you are. So it was just cool to see all of that. And it was, and then like, it's funny because like you have, there's some people where you're like, I don't get along with that person at all, or whatever. And then like 20 years later, I look back and I'm like Facebook friends with this person, and I'm like, oh, they're, I'm so glad that I got to know them, because they were just, so they just had such a different worldview than I did. And your worldview is just going to change so much as you continue to grow. So I think that's what's really cool about journalism and about being part of a news organization, is like, there's just so many different voices there, and so many different people from so many different backgrounds. I just think like, you just have to take advantage of that as much as you can. You have to, like I said, I think learn, what the skills that people have, I have a friend, one of my good friends from college, his name was BJ Reyes, and he just passed away a few weeks ago. But I've been thinking about him a lot, obviously. And he wound up working for the Associated Press. He came back and worked for the Penn State his last few years. He was just such a quick, fast, good reporter. Like, he was like the perfect Associated Press reporter, where it was like, he could just churn out copy like that, and I was always just like, how does he do that? How can he be so quick? How can he think these things through so quickly? And I think I just learned by watching what he could do, and learned the way that he could sort of piece a story together, and write prolifically and write fast. So it's just cool to be around all those different people, and just absorb what their experiences are, and realize that, like, and I think, I would think, and I hope that the Collegian is even a lot more diverse, ethnically, than it was when I was there. It was a pretty white campus. I assume it's still probably a pretty white campus, but I think it's obviously changed a lot, when I go back there and I see a lot more people of color, and I see a lot more people from different backgrounds. So I wish I had even more of that at the Collegian, because I think just that diversity is so important, especially in journalism, because you're going to be dealing with people from all sorts of backgrounds.
Well, I can probably say that I'd say we're a fairly diverse organization now.
Yeah.
A lot of our board of editors is extremely diverse, and I think my staff is pretty diverse. So,
well, even you said you're from New Orleans, which I don't think I knew anybody from New Orleans when I was in college, So it's like, that's kind of cool in itself,
No, absolutely. It is like, this is an organization that brings people together. It's one that it calls people from everywhere. And so I think I want to talk a little bit about sports, something that brings everyone together. Although the sports staff is from all over the place. One of my best reporters is from different majors, from different places in the country. One of my best reporters is from San Francisco. And then, some of my best reporters are biology majors because they love the game, but they also have a passion to write. And that's something that you've spoken a lot about. And I think your book, Season of Saturdays, is as a big focus on is explaining the love of sports to people. And that's something that's come up a lot in my life, is why do I write about sports versus anything else? What is so compelling about a child's game? So I know there's not a lot of people here who aren't sports reporters. And so I'd love for them to hear maybe your answer on that and your take on writing about sports.
Yeah, I think it took me a while to figure out what my voice was. I mean, it takes everybody a while to figure out what their writing voice is. But for me, I think what I figured out is that sports is a way for me to talk about everything else, you know? So it's like viewing things through the lens of sports is a way to talk about politics. It's a way to talk about history. It's a way to talk about business, you know? It's a way to talk about kind of America itself. So that sounds kind of highfalutin, but it's kind of true. It's like, I just think like, you know, that's the, you know, I kind of write a newsletter now, which is sort of sports history, but it's more just like, it's just for fun. And I just do it because I just have these ideas that, you know, I don't know what to do with, and I don't want to pitch them to some website and get paid $25 to write them, or whatever websites are paying these days. So, and they're also just so weird and offbeat, which is just kind of the way I think now anyway. So most places would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I just think like, you know, I try to think about these things, whatever's going on in the world, whatever's going on in the country, and think, how does sports sort of filter into that? And I think that's important no matter what you're writing about. But I think it's especially important with sports because so many people just view sports as like, oh, this thing in a vacuum, and there's no meaning to it. But it's life, man. There's like meaning to everything. You know, it's like, it's part of, you know, the Olympics is going on right now, and it's in China, and it's like, you can't separate the politics of what's going on in China with the Olympics themselves. And I sort of view all sports that way, where whatever's going on in the culture is going to be reflected in sports. You know, you saw that with Kaepernick. You know, you see that with what happened in the NBA and the WNBA. You know, you see that, you know, even what's happening in baseball right now, where there's a lockout, and it's like, there's sort of this push for workers' rights in all sorts of areas. And it's, you know, it's kind of a little bit of what's happening in baseball too. So I think you can see all these things and see, especially at such a politically charged moment like this, or just, but it's true all the time, you know. Sports don't exist in a vacuum. There's like that whole, for a while, there was that whole like stick to sports thing, you know, on Twitter, where people would, you know, sports writers would opine on various things, and people would be like, well, you're not qualified to have an opinion on this. But I think if you study anything, it's all interrelated, and sports is interrelated to everything else too, you know. So whatever beat you're covering, it's going to be interrelated to what's going on in, you know, State College. It's going to be interrelated to what's going on in Pennsylvania. It's going to be interrelated to what's going on in the rest of the country. And if you can figure out ways to make those connections, I think that's really powerful. I think that's what I try to do.
I think it's really funny that you mentioned it with that historical context. I was just talking, I don't know if you know Chris Raymond by chance, but I was about 2 weeks ago, I was having this very similar conversation about the narratives of sports, and the best way to talk about something like protesting the Vietnam War is to tell the story of Muhammad Ali. You know, maybe the best way to touch people's lives with a story about segregation is to talk about Jackie Robinson. So no, I think it's funny that you mentioned the exact same thing, and I think that holds true everywhere. So thank you for that. That was a great answer. Now I want to talk about maybe something a little more grand scheme, a little more existential, but how do you personally define success across your career? How has that changed from starting here at the Collegian? What would you consider success back then versus maybe what you're doing now, and the stage you are in your own life? What is success, and when are you successful? How would you put that to words?
Well, I think if you're a writer or a journalist, you're never going to feel successful. I think that's part of it. I think it's any sort of creative field. You never feel like you've succeeded, in part because you're always looking up at other people and you're like, well, why are they doing this and I'm not, you know? And so you kind of have to get beyond that professional jealousy, but it's not easy to do, you know? And I always feel like I'm probably way more focused on the things that didn't work for me, you know, the things like the book proposal that I did that fell through, you know, or the job that maybe I should have taken that I didn't. So I think, it took me a while to get beyond that and to sort of think like, what is success? And I think, even just in the last few years, I've started to realize that like, I think success is sort of figuring out how can I tell stories on my own terms in ways that I'm really excited about, so that's kind of what I'm really trying to focus on. And for a while, I lived in San Francisco, and I'm moving back to San Francisco probably this year. So, but San Francisco is an expensive place to live. I currently live in Portland, Oregon, which is not quite as expensive, and my girlfriend is also very successful, so that helps. But that's one thing I would say is if you can marry somebody who's in a very stable and successful field, that always helps, or have a partner who's is in a very stable and successful field, that always helps. But for a while, I really just had to grind and make money however I could, so I was writing columns for everybody and anybody that I could, because I needed to make money. And so I wasn't even thinking about like, what is my definition of success? It was like, how am I going to pay my rent next month? And how am I going to get by? And there might be periods like that for you guys where you just kind of have to grind, and you just kind of have to be like, I need to take some sort of job, do something for money. But as long as you're kind of thinking the bigger picture, and you're able to sort of think like, well, what do I want to do? What kind of stories do I want to tell? How can I tell them in a way that feels authentic to who I am? What's my voice as a writer? Especially when you're young, if you're able to, and you're able to, have a little financial freedom, which might not be true for all of you. Some of you might have to go out there and, get a job right away. But I think you just want to be able to tell those stories, like I said, in a way that feels authentic. And I think I never wanted to be bored. I think that's the main thing. I think it was like, I'll do something for a few years, and then, even with, like I said, with long form writing, I think I felt like I had burned myself out on that a little bit. So I was like, how can I tell these other stories? How can I get into, maybe doing a podcast? How can I get into at least trying to write a screenplay and seeing what the hell happens with that? How does that work? What's that medium all about? For me, I think that's the main thing. Maybe that is I don't know. I've never really thought about it before, but maybe that's my definition of success, is just not to be bored with my career, and like I said, I've had a little bit of the luxury and the freedom to have a lot of periods where I don't have to be bored with my career. I totally understand, like, some people, maybe you get married and you'll have kids and you're going to have a more stable job. And as long as you can find some sort of passion in that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, but as long as you can find some sort of way to be true to who you are, I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. For me, it was like I'm just sort of I'm just sort of a wanderer, malcontent, miscreant, whatever you want to call me. I don't know. So
yeah, it's funny you should say that. I think there's a running joke now when I hold my sports meetings. At some point, I always will mention something along the lines of, if you're not having fun, you should probably quit. Not that I don't embrace, hardship or adversity. In fact, I think the opposite. You should struggle through hard moments. And
it should definitely be hard. Yeah. Because if it's not hard, you're not growing at all, obviously, right? But it's like, there should be a level of, like, when I sit down at the keyboard to work on these podcasts, or to work on screenplays, or to work on even on certain written pieces that I still do, it's like, what's exciting about this? And now there's some stuff, where it's like, okay, I'm just doing this for money. I'm going to knock this out as quickly as I can. I'm going to make it as good as I can. I'm going to make the copy as clean as I can. And then hopefully just move on, but there's got to be something that you're just like, that you're excited about, I think, that makes you excited to, otherwise, that's kind of what writing is, what journalism is, what any sort of creative field if you're going to make those sacrifices and maybe not make as much money as some other people, and maybe struggle a little bit and deal with getting laid off and all that stuff, you got to have a passion for it in some way, you know?
Heartedly agree. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So Jade had a question. How would you recommend current Daily Collegian leadership tailor our structure or teachings to benefit staffers for the current journalism environment?
Whew. I don't know if I know. I'm not sure if I know how to answer that question. Tailor your structure or teachings. I mean, I think the only thing I can say is kind of what I've already said, which is like sort of encouraging people to diversify their skills, and maybe to get out of their comfort zone, whether it's covering a different beat, you know, or just maybe telling a different kind of story. You know, I'm not sure how much multimedia stuff you guys do these days, but you know, that's one way to maybe kind of think about telling different sorts of stories. Or maybe just kind of moving to a different staff, like I said, you know. So, you know, that's part of it. In terms of like the way that like the stories are structured, I mean, it just feels like that's an interesting question, because you know, the sort of standard newspaper model feels like it's changing so much, and the way that stories are told feels like it's changing so much. I mean, I think you just kind of have to study what some of these big places are doing, you know, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever else, and how are they telling stories, you know, and what can we take away from that? What can we sort of steal from them, you know? So I think that's, I don't know if that helps at all, you know, but I think it's kind of just that's probably the best advice I can give, is just to kind of just have a complete diversity of skills as much as possible, and be thinking of how to tell stories in a lot of different ways.
We had another question. Michael, are you your own publicist?
In what sense, I guess, like in terms of I don't know. I mean, I guess so. I certainly don't have a publicist who does anything for me. So, you know, I just kind of, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think at this point, publicizing your work is like probably going on Twitter and Facebook and putting up posts. Other than that, oh, in terms of marketing my books. Okay. Usually with books, there's sort of an in-house publicist, but a lot of it's going to be you kind of leveraging your connections and the people that you know. So in terms of like books and bigger projects like that, you know, you'll have a little help, but so much of it now is just kind of making those connections and social media and all that sort of stuff, I would say.
So we're sort of near the end of our time, so I've got a few more bigger questions to ask you. And one of them is about being an author. I feel like as a writer, that might be one of the ultimate accomplishments, is to say I wrote a book, or at least from a journalism standpoint. You know, we're writing these, I mean, in relation to a book, always short form pieces, and then to write a much larger medium seems to be incredibly difficult. At what point did you decide that you were going to write a book, and or what point did you know that I need to tell this story through such a long form medium?
So I actually wrote a couple of books when I was still in Akron. They were kind of I was ghostwriting for a NBA executive named Pat Williams, who writes like one book every 2 months or something like that. And they're sort of like leadership books. So that sort of was like, okay, I'm going to try this, see what this is like. And then I sort of wanted to, that's part of why I wanted to go to grad school for fiction writing, was to sort of, okay, how do I do this? How do I write fiction? How do I write a book? So I think it was something that I always wanted to do. I think for me, maybe journalism was the way toward, you know, writing books and longer form thinking. So it was always something that I had in the back of my mind. But then it's like, how do you do that? You know, how do you write a book? And the answer is you just kind of do it. The answer is like, you just kind of find a good idea. So, the book I wrote about the chess team in Brooklyn, I had actually written published a book of short stories before that, but I was sort of struggling writing fiction, and I was working at New York Newsday at the time. And I just this chess coach would like send out press releases for like when his team won tournaments or whatever. And I would always be like, why is he sending these to the sports department? So then I just kind of went out there and started hanging out with them. And I was like, well, maybe I'll just write an article about this team. And then, at that point I already had an agent, but I was like, this is a book. This is a book. And so then you're just like, okay, now I've got to write this book. I wrote a book proposal, which is its own separate thing, which is sort of like for nonfiction, you're like, okay, here's a sample chapter. Here's the table of contents. Here's what this book's generally going to be about. And then I sold it. And then it was like, well, crap, I got to write this thing. And, you just do it, you just sit down at the computer every day and you write, or you're out reporting, depending on what the book is. And you have a deadline and you're like, okay, this is like writing a very, very, very long story, article. So it just sort of happens. I think you kind of just, if you really want to do it, you have to be looking for those opportunities and then just like jump on them when you can, and then freak out and be like, how am I going to write this book? You spend about 6 months doing that. And then you're like, okay, I got a deadline. I got to start writing this book. So that's what you do. It's like, there's no great secret to it. The hard part is kind of navigating the world of like agents and things like that. And finding an agent. And some of that is going to be like making connections. I had a friend in Akron who published a book. So then he introduced me to his agent. And that's kind of how I, found my agent, my initial agent. So, that's, again, it's like making connections at the Collegian or making connections at wherever you work, can help with that kind of stuff. And then it's just like, okay, here's my chance. I got to do this. I have to take this chance and try it.
So I came across a piece of writing, I believe it's by you. It's from 1994. It's like some kind of senior column on sports writing.
Oh God. Okay.
And so I wanted to read a few quotes from it because I found them really remarkable.
Oh man. Okay.
Sorry. It takes more than a love for sports to be a great sports writer. It takes passion. It's about capturing humanity and injecting your own personality into it. It is experiencing everything and knowing everyone and not wanting your editor to cut that last goddamn line. And then at the end of the story, you mentioned Randy Galloway, a writer from Texas.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Fort Worth Star, I believe. And so you said he's smart, he's witty. Most importantly, he can weave a story with the best of them. He oozes feisty personality. I hope someday I'll have that passion. So I wanted to ask you, you said someday I want to have that passion. Do you think that now at this point in your career, or at what point do you think that you maybe found that passion or have that passion, or maybe discovered that you had reached that point you aspired to? And then I want to ask about the future. What are your dreams now? What do you aspire to now? What's the goal? And where's your heart set?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever, it's kind of like that idea of what's success, it's like, did I attain that? I have no idea. Maybe that's not even for me to say. Maybe there's something, it becomes more of an internal goal, it becomes more of, as you get older, you start to be like, I don't care about, working for Sports Illustrated or whatever I wanted to do when I was your guys' age, I just want to succeed kind of on my own terms and be able to tell stories on my own terms. So that to me is sort of, I guess, finding that passion, and it sort of ties into what I've mentioned in terms of the future which is to telling stories in different ways and in different mediums. And I just sort of love that challenge. I love that idea of like, okay, I know I can write a long form story pretty well. And I know that I can write, I can write a book. I've done it. What other challenges are there? What else do I want to do? What other stories do I want to tell, and how do I want to tell them? So it's just, you're always kind of chasing that thing. You're always kind of chasing that next thing. But I think as long as you're chasing it on your own terms, instead of chasing it because you think like, well, that's what my goal was when I was 22, or 21, or however old you guys are, your goals are going to change, things are going to change. I cringe when I like go back and look at my stuff that I wrote for the Collegian. You guys will do the same someday. You'll go back and you'll be like, oh my God, I can't believe I wrote that, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm kind of still sort of chasing what that passion is, and it's changing. The medium that it's in is maybe changing constantly. But I think that idea of like kind of, being a good storyteller and telling great stories doesn't change, that's kind of what I still want to do.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Well, yeah. Well,
you're a big quotes guy, I see. So
yeah,
I see in the notes. So yeah, thanks for quoting myself back to me from God knows how many years ago. Yeah.
no problem. Anytime. No, thank you for that answer. Thank you for your honesty today, all the advice you've given us, and a real frank look at the world of journalism today and what you do. Thank you for your humility and your truthfulness. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and if I can help any of you guys, feel free to reach out to me. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. So email, whatever advice I can give, I'm happy to.
Zach, you got your hand up. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I just have one more question. I put it in the chat, but I said in a very uncertain field that could collapse and might not be a primary source of income at times, like you said, would you choose to be a journalism major now? And if not, what is the best way to go, in your opinion?
That's a good question. Personally, I might not, but like I said, the sports journalism program didn't exist when I was there. And for me, that might have been a pretty powerful lure, in terms of like what else to major in. I can't really give like specific advice. I'd kind of have to know like what your interests were. But for me, I think, even majoring in English or something, that would have allowed me to read more and things like that, to read more widely, probably would have been, in retrospect, for me, a more natural fit. But in terms of like I think you just have to, that's I can't really answer that question. I think it's sort of thinking about, well, what if journalism doesn't work out for me? What would I want to do? What kind of thing? And what would sort of supplement my journalism career if I do kind of want to be in this business and kind of stay in this business? What would be sort of the best secondary skill for me to have? I think that's probably the best way to think about it. But I think you have to think long and hard about it. I think you have to really think like, how badly do I want to be a journalist? How badly do I want to be in this field? Because it's tough right now, and it's probably not going to get any easier anytime soon. And if you really, really want to do it, and you hear me say that, and you're like, screw you, I'm going to make it, then maybe you want to major in journalism. But if you're like, I don't know about that, then maybe you want to start thinking about something else,
I definitely want to keep this open for if anyone else has any other questions, but obviously, I want to be respectful of Michael's time. I'm not sure what the rest of your day is looking like. We've hit that 5 o'clock.
Just staring at the computer. Well, it's only 2 o'clock for me, so staring at the computer for a couple more hours.
Great.
Yeah, but like I said, anybody who wants to email me or reach out to me, feel free.
Thank you so much for such an informative discussion, and thank you, Luke, for leading it. And we appreciate everyone's participation. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks.
Michael.
Thanks for turning out. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks for talking to us.
All right.